Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, MS4, Putting the Pieces Together. My name is Ruth Hawker. I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and we'll get started with the webinar in just a moment. I will ask you, if you are attending and you are on the phone, if you would please mute your phone to avoid any unnecessary audio feedback. At this time, I will turn over the controls to our presenters from URS, Melissa Hess, and Andrew Wishart.
Thanks, Ruth.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thanks, Ruth. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to put this in slideshow mode. I'd like to thank the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for including us in today's webinar. It's really been a great experience working with them over the past several months, and I think they've been outstanding advocates for the municipalities in Pennsylvania as well as the Bay. Like I said, my name is Melissa Bernardo Hess, and I'm with a company called URS. For those of you that don't know URS, we'll get into that in just a second. But with me also today is Andy Wishart. We are both in offices in the Chesapeake Bay area, and we both do a lot of stormwater management and water quality work. For those of you that don't know URS, we're a pretty large international company. We're one of the largest engineering firms in the nation. And just to give you an idea, we have about 3,000 staff located in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Something else that's interesting about URS is we have a corporate water resources national practice, which means, we take our water resources pretty seriously. We also have a corporate green infrastructure practice, which I'm also a part of. And we've done a lot of MS4 work in Pennsylvania and in the other states that are dealing with the Chesapeake Bay. Our website's up there if anybody's interested in more information about URS. So what are we going to talk about today? The goal of today is to talk about what's going on in Pennsylvania with their MS4 permit and how they need to comply with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. Now, I understand that we have some audience members that are coming from far and wide, and welcome. I'm glad that you've all joined us. But what we're going to focus on today is the Pennsylvania municipalities and how this applies to them. So I kind of just wanted to go over the who, what, when, where, and why you should care about this. So we're going to talk about the new Pennsylvania MS4 permit for smaller municipalities and why it's important. We're going to talk about who needs to comply and what they need to do as far as these permit deadlines. We're going to talk quite a bit about how you can achieve these goals, because there are a lot of things that people need to do to be a part of this. And then the question that everybody asks is, where can I get help? I had a client say to me once, Melissa, just tell me what I have to do and how I'm going to pay for it. So I can help you with the first part. The second part is where it gets interesting, but that's what Andy's going to help us out with today. So with that, we'll get started. The goals of today's webinar, really, we want to help inform you so that you can inform others. If you're sitting at your desk right now and you're from a municipality in Pennsylvania, I want you to be able to ask the right questions of the Pennsylvania DEP. Those are the folks that are administering your MS4 permit. I want you to be able to talk to your teams, kind of figure out what you need to do to defend your budgets. Basically, I want you to help get what you need. So that's what I'm hoping you can take away from today, that you'll be more informed than you were when we started. So let's go right in. Why is stormwater runoff a problem? It's not necessarily the water that's a problem, although we have been getting a lot of snow and rain lately. One of the biggest problems is when the rain falls on those hard surfaces that we all have, like roads and driveways and parking lots, it takes all of that pollution into our local streams. And ultimately, that ends up in the Chesapeake Bay for most of us. So that's why we're concerned about the runoff, and we want to do something about it. This is just a great shot of the bay from a couple years ago, before and after a major event, and you can see just from the left to the right the amount of pollution and sediment that was transferred just in this one individual event. So this is why. And it's not just the major flooding events, it's the localized flooding events as well. I'm sure a lot of you out there have that street that every time it rains, it's shut down, or every time you get complaints from a certain neighborhood because the basements are flooded or the inlets are clogged. Localized flooding can be a real problem in some of these municipalities. There's also the extreme event flooding that we get. I believe these are from Tropical Storm Lee, and granted, these are a more extreme idea of what the flooding is that we're hoping to control with some of these requirements, but it's all things that as municipalities we're thinking about and we're concerned about. But like I mentioned before, one of the big things we're going to talk about today is the pollutants. I took this picture for a client, and we still never figured out what all that green stuff was around their riser, but at this point I'm not sure I want to know. But the point is you've got a lot of things going on in your streams. You're going to have a lot of sediment buildup in a lot of your facilities, and the question is, what steps can we take as municipalities to really reduce this at the source, try and have less water, less pollutants, because it's going to be a lot cheaper to deal with it at the source than it is to try and remove things afterwards. That costs a lot more money, and by the time things get to the bay, we're just talking about such a massive quantity that it's not going to make sense. We really need to be looking individually in our own backyards and our municipalities to see what's going on. So a lot of you are already looking at your watersheds in Pennsylvania. You're already trying to do your assessment to figure out what your goals are. And some of them are a little more obvious than others. You want to improve your water quality. You don't want to have as many pollutants. You want to reduce the flooding that you get, that localized flooding we talked about from your common rain events. And it's not just about repairing the troubled areas at this point, but you also want to protect the areas that are still good. That's why a lot of times our municipalities are now looking at watersheds as a whole, because you're always going to have those areas that look like the bottom picture there that are just torn up and you're going to need to repair. But you also want to look at the areas that are still pretty healthy and figure out how you can continue on that route. And obviously, we do have a lot of regulatory requirements, so we're going to do that. But when you put all these things together, all of us are really looking at improving the overall watershed health in our municipalities, because that does help benefit the Chesapeake Bay as well. So what are the benefits to having a strong stormwater program? Well, these are just some of the ones that we've found that are important to folks in Pennsylvania. Fishing and boating and recreation, these are all things that people enjoy. And we're not going to dwell too much on these because, as a lot of you know, it's not about meeting the requirements. It's also about doing the things that benefit your community as a whole. And when you have improved environment, that's generally when it tends to be improved economic situations as well. So it's important to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. So since we are in a regulatory environment and we are talking about MS4 permits, let's get in and see why it is that we want to do this. In Pennsylvania, your MPDES permit is administered by the Pennsylvania DEP. And you can see here we've got a lot of regulatory requirements starting at the very big umbrella of the EPA Clean Water Act and really coming down to some of your local requirements. Now, because we're talking about Pennsylvania's new MS4 permit for smaller communities and municipalities, there are going to be two things that we're going to focus on later that are different from before. That's the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, requirements in the form of a pollutant reduction plan. You can tell we love acronyms in this business. So when you hear me talk about the TMDL that we're going to talk about, that's basically the pollution diet that the Chesapeake Bay has been put on. And when you hear us talk about PRPs, or pollutant reduction plans, those are going to be things that you're specifically going to develop as part of your permit to meet those requirements. Pennsylvania also did a watershed implementation plan that we're going to discuss a little bit. That's how they kind of break it down by state, municipality, and we're also going to talk about some local TMDL plans, because some of you sitting out there probably also have TMDLs on some of your streams that have nothing to do with the bay. Maybe you have one for bacteria. Maybe you have a different one for sediment or PCBs. We're going to talk about those as well. But these basically kind of give you the regulatory requirements that are driving a lot of the actions that the municipalities are going to be taking. So let's talk about the bay. Great picture of the bay, Pennsylvania taking up a large part of the northern piece. And I won't read you all these, but you can see it's a huge watershed, 64,000 square miles, 6 states plus the District of Columbia. This is a really varied land use watershed, so it's a lot to take in. And that's why people are really trying to break this down, not just at the state level, but really at the watershed level to look at how they can adopt these changes. Now, this is nothing new. There's been a lot of restoration efforts in the bay to date, starting back in the 30s and leading up to today when we talked about this Chesapeake Bay TMDL coming out. So the important thing that I hope you can take away from today is what this Chesapeake Bay pollution diet is. And what this means is, back in 2010, when everybody, the 6 states and the District of Columbia, agreed on this TMDL, there are 3 things that they said they were going to put the bay on a diet for: sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So those are really the pollutants of concern when you're talking about the bay TMDL. And you, in Pennsylvania, your MS4 permit, is going to help you figure out how to comply with the requirements of that Chesapeake Bay TMDL. And Pennsylvania is not unique in this. A lot of the other states as well are putting their Chesapeake Bay requirements out through the MS4 permits because it's the most effective mechanism that they've found for getting people to comply and kind of getting everybody on the same page with their reporting and their requirements. So there are other pollutants that can affect what's going on in the bay. Like I said, I've highlighted those top 3, but you also might have some other ones that you may either have a TMDL for or just know that you've concerned. Everybody's concerned about trash. Sometimes you will see people with TMDLs for bacteria, maybe some other organics that they have going up, but these are typically the things that when we go in and do a watershed assessment, these are the kinds of things we're looking at to see what's affecting your water quality. So anybody out there have an outfall that looks like this? I hope not. And I don't remember exactly where this picture was taken, but I hope they've cleaned it up a little bit by now. This is more commonly what we see after the big rain events, and you've got a lot of stuff going on. I think probably all of you have had an outfall that looks like this at one point. So in keeping up with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL milestones, these are for the entire program. So really they have target reductions to get to by 2025. But the more important piece are the reductions by 2017. What they're basically telling the states is they want 60% of those BMPs that you're going to put in place to get these reductions, they want them implemented by 2017. And then everybody's going to have these reporting milestones every 2 years. They're going to be giving annual reports based on your pollutant reduction plan and complying with the WIP. So those are some of the big milestones that, again, will be spelled out in your permit. The WIP that you heard me mention, or Watershed Implementation Plan, is something that Pennsylvania has also participated in. Again, they're not alone. A lot of the states have done this. But it's basically a roadmap to show how we're going to get to where we need to be by 2025 with those interim dates of 2017. And there's a great website here that shows the planning targets for Pennsylvania. So this is something that if you wanted to check out, these are just some of the examples that we have from some of the municipalities that we dealt with recently. So within the WIP, you get some county-level planning targets as well. These were developed by DEP, and they're guidance for how you're going to achieve what everybody's trying to achieve. They're currently pretty flexible. DEP is not requiring specifics on a lot of these, but it's important for you to know what your waste load allocations are, how they're going to be subdivided. Basically, you're going to want to tackle the low-hanging fruit first. Not one of my favorite expressions, but it's true. You want to really try and see what you can achieve right off the bat for the least amount of money, and then you move on to some of the other things that you need to do on these planning targets. So this slide I left up here because it's completely obnoxious as far as the definition of what is an MS4. You've heard us talk about this MS4 permit. So it's a municipal separate storm sewer permit. And as you can see, that means you have a conveyance, and there's a whole bunch of things, criteria that go along with it. And again, I left all these words up there just to show you that there is a pretty lengthy definition, but the bottom line is it's defined in your permit as the portion of the MS4 located within a designated urban area, and it's designated by DEP. So if you have questions about whether you are an MS4, whether you're still an MS4, whether you used to be an MS4, those are things that you're going to want to contact your local DEP representative to discuss. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to assume that everybody here has an MS4 that they're concerned about. Another question we get a lot from clients is, what is an outfall? Now again, you need to use the definition in your permit, but what you can ask yourself is, do I have a point source? Is it discharging from my MS4, and is it discharging into the waters of Pennsylvania or waters of the U.S.? And if you answered yes to these, then it's an outfall. If you aren't sure, again, I'm going to refer you to DEP for their guidance because they are the ones that are administering your program. Just some examples of some outfalls that are not in the greatest of shape. A lot of outfall issues that we will see, you get erosion around them, you get a lot of sediment deposition because of the things that are coming out, trash and debris because anything that's in those pipes is eventually going to dump out right there in your stream, and then you will get some that are in complete disrepair. But these outfall issues should clue you into the fact that you've got some things going on upstream that we need to be worried about. So going back to the MS4 permit, what you're going to hear us talk a lot today about is the Phase 2 general permit, and that's for the smaller municipalities. Who needs one? Probably you do. Again, if you're in an MS4 area, and we're going to stick with that for the purposes of today, you most likely need one. Now, there are also individual permits that Pennsylvania administers. Most likely you already know if you're required to have an individual permit if you have some special protection areas, or if there's anything significant about the waters that you're discharging. You probably already know if you need an individual permit. Again, you can always check with DEP if you're not sure. And this new permit, what does it require? We're going to talk about implementing a strong stormwater management program. Important that you track progress toward the goals of your program, and you've got to report that progress. I had someone say to me once, you know, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So it's really important that you're tracking this progress towards your goals and reporting it in your annual reports to DEP. And it's going to take more labor hours than before, not just for the reporting, but for the maintenance, the upkeep, the O&M, the work. So it's just something that when you're planning your budgets, you're going to need to be prepared for. I was just going to go quickly over the 6 minimum control measures. These were in your existing MS4 permit. So these are not new to you. The new things are what we're going to talk about after this. So let me quickly go through these. The first one being public education and outreach. There are lots of ways you can develop outreach for your communities, but the important thing again is to make sure that you keep track of what you're doing and report it in accordance with your permit. Whether it's the number of flyers you distributed at the local county fair or the number of homeowners that you met with at certain meetings, you want to make sure you're keeping track. Public involvement and participation is another great one, especially if you have volunteer programs that you maybe already have started or you're thinking about starting. Again, the important thing is you want to not only do them because it's a great opportunity to get all those stakeholders to buy into what you're trying to achieve, but make sure you're reporting and keeping track of the meetings you're having and storm drains that are stenciled and any events you have so that you can report that and get credit for it in your permit. I won't talk too much about illicit discharges because we could obviously spend an hour on those, but basically if you've got water coming out of your pipes when it's not raining, there's a possibility that you have an illicit discharge. And again, you're going to need to track that with your sewer mapping. You want to make sure you report it, and then if it turns out to be an education issue, you can fold that back into one of your other measures because you need to make sure that people are no longer doing the activities that are causing this illicit discharge. Construction site stormwater runoff, obviously another big concern because we all know what it looks like when you get a big open construction site. The silt fence can only do so much. So it's all about education on this one, making sure your ordinances are in place and keeping track of what you're doing. Same thing with post-construction. You want to make sure that you are, anything that needs to be recorded with your post-construction erosion and sediment control, you want to make sure that you're keeping track of that, and this will keep you in compliance with the 6 minimum measures. Good housekeeping is the last one. This is the one that everybody always seems to have the best intentions on, but it's also the easiest one for things to slip through the cracks. Making sure your employees are trained, educating anybody that's on your site and in the community, and again, reporting in accordance with your permit. This covers a lot. I threw some photos in here just to show you whether you have equipment parking, if you're a bus depot, if you've got dumpsters on your site, maybe you're doing waste handling and disposal. There's always something here that you can improve your good housekeeping on. At this time of year, sand, salt, cinders, I'm sure nobody even wants to think about that anymore. I think we're all ready for spring. But the point is there's always going to be things on your site that are worth taking a look at to make sure that you're using the best housekeeping practices. So here's where we get into what's different about the permit. If you're discharging into impaired waters, which in this case we're going to talk about two things. If you have another TMDL that is outside the bay, such as bacteria, or if you're draining to the bay and you need the Chesapeake Bay PRP. Now, for those of you listening today in Pennsylvania, you may need one or both of these, depending on where your streams are. And we've listed some websites here that can help you figure out where exactly you are. And the big thing you'll want to remember here is that you've got about 12 months from the effective date of your permit to put these in place. And everybody's permit effective date is going to be different because it depends on when you actually apply for coverage. If you do need a TMDL plan for an individual TMDL, you're going to want to go ahead and put this plan together and describe how you're going to achieve your goals. You also need to have a strategy and some design details for how you're going to go through and accomplish this. And the permit does list these very specific steps of how you can go through and develop this plan. Again, if you have questions on this, DEP is going to be your best bet since they are administering this, but I think it's going to be worth your while to go through and look at these steps based on where you are in your municipality and see where you need to be. The Chesapeake Bay PRP is a little different. This you're going to have to do similar steps, but again, these are all going to be related to the bay drainage and the estimate of what you're currently contributing and how you can fix that. So the next question we get from everybody is, so how do I take on these challenges? And I'm going to let Andy discuss some of these with you.
Good afternoon. I think Melissa did a great job talking about your stormwater plan as well as some of your permit requirements. I'm going to start off talking about potential challenges. And I think when we were out there doing our information gathering and input seminars with the local municipalities, one thing that came up quite frequently was property ownership. What am I responsible for? If the outfall is on somebody's private property, do I have to monitor that outfall? Or if I'm doing pollutant reduction, how do I achieve a level of pollutant reduction simply by addressing issues in the right-of-way or municipal-owned properties? So if you look here, the first three bullets speak to property issues associated with stormwater. And as a municipality, your stormwater implementation, your retrofit opportunities, and maintenance plans are often limited by the property ownership issues. Maintenance agreements, access easements, and enforcement protocols are ways to ensure that these types of facilities are maintained properly. Now, many of the new pollutant reduction requirements are difficult to meet, like I said, especially when you're limited to those public rights-of-ways and to those municipal-owned properties. One way to address these are homeowner and business incentive programs. You know, it's a different approach that increases the opportunities for new and retrofit facilities. Now, obviously, these work better if there is a financial driver behind it, like a stormwater fee or a stormwater utility. The last bullet is what we all end up talking about, which is funding, and then perhaps the greatest challenge in this whole puzzle is finding the money to do these things. If your annual budget, doesn't have a large line item in it for stormwater, and I haven't really met anybody who has that large line item, you'll need to find other ways to fund new projects as well as the operations and maintenance. So we'll get into that discussion a little later today. Maintenance does matter. Now we're going to look at this slide and the next slide. You know, maintenance matters for both traditional gray infrastructure as well as for green infrastructure. You can't put things in the ground, forget about them, and expect them to function as designed. So, you know, as a consultant, a significant portion of our work is based around redesigning or retrofitting facilities that have simply failed due to neglect. And as a municipality, and as you know, Melissa and I will demonstrate later and talk about later, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Take care of it ahead of time, and you will never have to replace it, or hopefully you won't have to replace it. Now, these pictures show some extreme examples of inlets and outfalls that have been neglected, but unfortunately, they're not that rare. Non-functioning infrastructure is ineffective at serving its purpose, and in turn, these types of things become contributors to polluted runoff. Here's another good one. You'll see the picture on the left is a stormwater pond riser that an HOA has apparently neglected, and they didn't consider maintenance a priority. When they might consider a priority is when you have that large storm that comes in and can't discharge through your riser, ends up overtopping your dam embankment and flooding your neighborhood. You know, there we go. Sorry for a second. The picture on the right is a prime example of good intentions. You have a great-looking, well, what would be a great-looking green infrastructure practice. I'm sure the town spent a lot of money on design and implementation of this flow-through device, but what they really got now is a really expensive leaf catcher. This facility isn't going to function because it hasn't been maintained. So in this instance, the O&M plan for this type of facility should take into account seasonal variations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about potential solutions. We're going to talk about potential solutions in the context of developing and maintaining a strong stormwater program. Most obvious is the traditional capital improvement plans that fund gray and green improvements. However, as we all know, given the tight budgets that many municipalities face today, this budgetary line item is usually insufficient to address many associated issues. Pollution prevention, I just talked about a little bit, but we're going to keep hammering away on it. It's far cheaper to prevent your water pollution than it is to treat it afterwards. By developing and implementing strategies to prevent, you'll be saving your town money in the long run. The next bullet, I'll just say share the burden. You know, coordinate with your other local jurisdictions. You know, coordination can create cost savings by optimizing manpower, equipment, and materials. Talk to your neighboring towns or boroughs about a coordinated effort to tackle big problems on small budgets. Aside from O&M, the other thing you'll hear repeated time and time again is education and outreach. Melissa's already said it several times. I'll probably say it several more. Education and outreach is a key to any effective stormwater program. We need to facilitate operational and behavioral changes. Okay, these are some of the more traditional or common stormwater practices. I'm sure a lot of you out there have seen these. I'm hoping that you've seen these. We'll talk a little bit about their function and their purpose, and we'll talk about some of the basic do's and don'ts of maintaining them. So we'll start with the granddaddy of them all, and I'm sure everybody here has seen one of these. Dry detention ponds provide peak flow management. However, they don't really have much of an inherent water quality benefit. These facilities have very basic maintenance protocols. You'll see those on the slide. I would point out the don't here, the applying fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides. Obviously, we don't, this is in the prevention mode. We don't want to apply fertilizers and wash them downstream and try and treat them later. From a pollution prevention standpoint, and I'll use another term Melissa doesn't like, it's low-hanging fruit, she may have mentioned already. These are the low-hanging fruit of the retrofit opportunities. Our company currently works for various local and state agencies evaluating these types of facilities for retrofit opportunities. They are quite frequently the biggest bang for the buck. There's another one. All right, step up from your dry ponds or your wet ponds. Wet ponds provide both quantity and quality management. Now, the maintenance for these types of facilities is a little more cumbersome, but if you go through the do's, it's pretty common sense. Now, the dry pond to wet pond conversion is something you may want to consider when you're talking pollution prevention or pollution reduction plans. Infiltration trenches, you've probably seen these. Sometimes they can be mistaken for a riprap channel. Infiltration trenches are generally sized for the first flush or 1 year frequently storm events. They're generally easy to construct. However, their functionality is going to depend on their placement and what's upstream of the facility. These facilities provide water quality through groundwater recharge. The maintenance protocols, again, I would ask you to read those. Maintenance protocols require a hands-on approach for removal of sediment and vegetation. Don't let children or even adults play in them. If you guys, any of you are out there are parents, you know the easiest way to break something is to let your kids play in it. So let's move on to the next one. Hydrodynamic separators. You may or may not have familiarity with these. These vault or manhole-sized devices can come in many proprietary forms. They're separators, and they do just that. They pull out the sediments and oils and greases from your stormwater runoff. Most of them have a defined maintenance program depending on who you buy them from, and oftentimes these companies will sell a maintenance package along with the unit. Generally, these are offline facilities taking first flush or small 1 year events. As with any kind of underground or formal vault type system, the upfront costs here are a limiting factor. Drywall seepage pit, we'll refer to drywall seepage pit, just is a less appealing term. I'm sure everybody's seen these. These facilities are just smaller versions of infiltration trenches, and they become more commonplace in residential applications, serving your rooftop downspouts. Small drywalls have become very commonplace. Educating homeowners, here we talk about public education and outreach. Educating the homeowners is critical to increasing the continued functions of these types of facilities. So in this instance, now you've combined O&M with your education and outreach. There's your do's and don'ts. Again, nothing overly complicated. Stream restoration. Let's talk a little bit about that. Stream restoration is not always thought about as a stormwater BMP. Aside from the aesthetic benefits, these types of projects reduce sediment transmission and can be done in conjunction with floodplain restoration. Associated landscaping and buffer planting components provide additional nutrient reductions. Here's a nice picture. This is post-construction, obviously. And our office does a lot of these related to asset management, but the water quality benefit you get from these is undeniable. For anybody out there listening in Lancaster County, if you want to use this as an excuse, you can head to the Conestoga Country Club and see the improvements they made to the little Conestoga that runs through their property. Something similar to what you see here. You have a J-hook or a cross vane. You have some bank stabilization. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm going to take us through some of our green infrastructure slides. This is near and dear to my heart because this is something that I do for a lot of clients. And a lot of people ask the first question, what is green infrastructure? So basically what we're going to do in the context of today is talking about stormwater green infrastructure and reconnecting that stormwater to the ground through infiltration or to other green areas and restoring the watershed by doing that. There are multiple benefits to this. And what I want to mention is that what it is not today is anything that has to do with green buildings or carbon footprint or energy efficiency. We're just going to focus on the stormwater for today. And there are lots of green alternatives that are gaining popularity. I've seen a lot of municipalities coming up with their own green streets or green alleys programs. A lot of the green alleys, I think, are modeled after what was done in Chicago, but there's some great municipalities in Pennsylvania and Maryland that have started doing those. Bioretention is always popular. People love plants. But people are also realizing that they want to be reusing this rainwater as a resource instead of just trying to get it off their property as fast as they can. So we're going to go through just a couple of these that I think might be attractive to you as municipalities as you're going through and trying to find alternatives at the site level as you're looking at your watersheds. Bioretention gardens have been very effective, especially in road rights-of-way. The picture there is one that we did where we were actually using flat under drains like they use on golf courses. They actually proved to be a pretty popular alternative for dealing with any overflow that we would get from these bioretentions. So, you know, the important thing to remember here is that these are designed. You're not just digging a hole and putting plants in the ground. You really want to make sure you have the right engineered design with these, and they can be very effective, and they can look great as well. If you have areas with steep slopes, we've had clients really enjoy the cascades because it slows the flow down and allows for the infiltration. I will say that cascades can be more expensive because of the amount of concrete that you're using in the weirs. We've had some clients get creative and use plastic or wooden weirs to help out in the same capacity. But again, very popular in road rights-of-way. This is something we're seeing more municipal clients and clients in ultra-urban areas be attracted to are these curb extensions or curb bump outs, whatever you prefer to call them locally, with below-grade storage. Because if you've got that clayey soil in some of your areas, you know you're not going to get a great infiltration rate without some help. And rather than doing the soil amendments in this particular area, they decided to do below-grade storage. The bump out provided some vegetation. It also provided some traffic calming. It was a neighborhood enhancement, plus it really was a great way of dealing with the stormwater. Just some quick bioretention maintenance do's and don'ts. Something that I will say here is when you're working with contractors who aren't used to doing green infrastructure, you do need a little extra training. Whether it's reminding them not to park the backhoe in the rain garden overnight when they're in between doing things on the construction site, or not compacting the soil when they're building it. There are all sorts of things, and you're kind of going to have to be flexible and learn as you go on some of these designs because they really are site-specific. These are just some examples of commercial street alternatives that we've done. We've had great luck with clients when they're doing pervious sidewalks or permeable pavers over top of storage because, again, you're getting the infiltration, and if you don't have the good soil infiltration rates, you can kind of store it and then release it at a later time. The maintenance is pretty self-explanatory on these. You really don't want to have permeable pavements next to a lot of leaf debris like Andy showed before because then you just have a leaf catcher and a green BMP that isn't very effective. Tree boxes, a lot of people like tree boxes. I know some people are concerned about having the trees completely encased in concrete, so we have seen open bottom tree box applications, but either way it adds great landscaping to your streets, and trees provide such a valuable resource, not just for stormwater, but for air quality, for shade, for heat island effects. There's all sorts of great things about tree boxes as long as you take care of them. Neighborhood improvements, this is just an example of a before and after. I'll show it one more time. You can see the before and the after of have we turned something that was into something that is a little more progressive with the permeable pavers and the bioretention in there. Still having your existing infrastructure for overflow, but adding the green component to complement it. There are a lot of other green infrastructure techniques that we've seen used on private properties. Rain gardens have become very popular, especially when you can get some of the beautiful native plantings. A lot more people are also looking into rain barrels so that when they have droughts, when we get some of these really warm, humid summers and we don't want to be spending the money to do the water out of our tap to water our gardens and our vegetables and everything else, you can use some of the water from the rain barrels. Green roofs, maybe not as popular in residential applications yet, unless it's on a smaller shed or a flat roof in the back, but a lot of commercial properties are starting to realize that having a green roof can be a benefit to their employees. People like to look out the window and see it. If it's a roof that's accessible to others, they can add benches and it becomes an amenity for the employees, somewhere else to go have your lunch other than the break room that's next to everybody's cubicle. Again, the maintenance is very similar to the bioretention, so I won't read this to you. And the rain barrels, again, the most important thing here is to make sure that you're not getting a lot of gunk into it and to make sure that you don't let it freeze over the winter and wreck everything. The last thing I'll say about green infrastructure is that the O&M is a little different, but it's also critical to the success of these BMPs. The maintenance program you have now for your traditional BMPs is probably going to need to be tweaked a bit so that it can keep up with the maintenance that you're going to need for these green infrastructure. It's a great way to do education and outreach with private property owners. We've had a lot of success in doing that with clients where they have incentives for people to implement green infrastructure on their private property, and it really does make a difference in the watershed as a whole. You can also look for non-structural BMPs. For those of you that are going to be on our webinar next Wednesday where we're talking about BMP pollutant removal efficiencies, you can also look at non-structural things, whether it's different source controls you're doing, IDDE, or some sort of good housekeeping. You can also get credit for these, but as Andy mentioned, it's a lot of times a lot easier and cheaper to do it before than to try and do it after. Operational strategies are another things that we can talk about, because I think when you have an area-wide management plan or you really have a public education strategy that goes municipality-wide, you can make changes to your operations that can help others make the changes to what they're doing. But I'll harp on this one last time, because reporting is so very important to make sure that you are keeping track of what you're doing so you can get credit for it and see how effective your programs are being. One last thing I want to talk about is putting it all together, because I think this is really important, and it's a comment that we get from a lot of municipalities, is if only our departments were talking to each other. Then when we have a curb and gutter project or a road repaving or a sidewalk project, we could implement some green infrastructure or some stormwater management at that point. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of municipalities, they're waiting until the last minute, until we're getting more final design plans and you're ready to go to E&S review, and that's when the stormwater folks are coming in to look at it. So if we can really get people identifying these opportunities earlier on, I think you're going to have a successful way of doing these, and then you can save some money because you're already out there doing the work. And one last thing I'll say is that tracking progress is very important. You've got to keep records of what you're doing. You got to know what to track, and you want to learn as you go kind of what the most effective ways are. And the big thing everybody wants to talk about is, how am I going to pay for this? So I'm going to let Andy take us home with a discussion of funding opportunities.
All right, let's talk about money. And for those municipal officials out there, I hope I have your attention. We're going to talk about three categories of funding opportunities, the short-term, long-term, and what I'll call the alternative. And we're going to go ahead and start with the short-term, which focuses on grants and loans. Grants, quite simply, are funds awarded by various agencies to achieve specific goals. The key to this whole grant process is to match these goals with any prospective projects that may be in your town, borough, county, or watershed. And while nothing is free, grants provide that much-needed monetary support for stormwater-related projects, including planning, design, implementation, and outreach. The downside to grants is that you simply can't always count on them. They're not available on a regular basis. Winning them is never guaranteed, and year by year they're becoming increasingly competitive. If your probability of winning a grant is 1 in 3, then I would consider that a favorable opportunity. PennVest. PennVest, I'm sure if you're living in the state of Pennsylvania, I'm not going to describe what PennVest is, but PennVest is an example of an agency that administers low-interest loans in Pennsylvania. including some of EPA's programs. EPA G3 is listed here as well. EPA G3 stands for Green Streets, Green Jobs, and Green Towns. It's a federal and state initiative. However, the G3 is also a grant program administered by the Chesapeake Bay Trust for the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, funding both design and implementation projects. All right. So grants are something that I do on a regular basis. We work with many municipal clients in identifying projects that align with various grant opportunities, and we also assist them in building grant proposals. Now, while every different grant agency has different award criteria, there are a few main components I want to go over that most look for in a successful application. First and foremost, bring something to the table. Bringing cash or in-kind match to the project demonstrates to that funding agency that you're committed and you're serious about getting a project done. Now, for townships or boroughs that sit there and say, well, you know what, we don't have that kind of money sitting around to bring to the table, in-kind match is also an alternative. Now, in-kind match can be realized through manpower, outreach, mailings, and volunteer hours. And you can quantify these and put a dollar amount to them. Advertise the project within your community and make it visible. You know, grant agencies want to be seen. They want their projects to be seen. So, again, use that education outreach component to get the word out, to get people excited, to get people involved. Finally, you want to maximize the scope and benefits by including a very cross-section of project partners. You know, we mentioned the watershed groups, but include your local businesses. By all means, include your local schools and your citizen groups. And I'm going to plug the foundation here. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation certainly should be included in this list of potential partners. The next few slides are going to show you a couple of, I'll flip back and forth here, some of the various grant providers as well as their various programs. Now you'll see there's a lot of different programs under each provider, and under those programs there are also several different tracks. So at the end of the day, you have a wide variety of opportunities to consider. Now in the past, I've worked closely with the Trust and with NIFWIF in procuring grant funds. And I'll say this, each one is adamant about give them a call, talk to them, you know, have that initial conversation to evaluate whether or not your project is going to align with their funding. You know, that way you're not spending a lot of time and energy putting a grant proposal together that just doesn't fit. Stormwater utilities, oh boy. If you've been anywhere near Pennsylvania or Maryland and you know anything about stormwater, you know this is a hot button issue. Similar to water or sewer user fees, a stormwater utility assesses a fee usually based on impervious cover to fund stormwater programs and projects required to meet the new permit requirements. For those that oppose them, it's often referred to as a rain tax, and like I said, it is a hot button issue. If you're actually interested in pursuing this, I will say that the success of any stormwater utility is going to rely greatly on public and government support ahead of time. Okay, the stormwater utility process, here it is in a nutshell. The stormwater utility process is aimed at determining the cost of your current stormwater service program and the cost of maintaining that, and utilizing that cost to determine the basis for potential fees. Now, as you can see, it's a process that includes outreach, some financial analysis, some implementation, and outreach. It's definitely something that requires a lot of grassroots level support, and hopefully you have like I said, a political advocate to help your cause. Stormwater fees. Stormwater fees are very similar to the utility. However, it's a fee assessed by the town to fund stormwater projects. It's not managed by a utility authority. Public-private partnerships. This is a different P3 than pollution prevention plan. Public-private partnerships, it's not a new concept in the business world, but it is somewhat new to the world of stormwater management. And I'm just going to briefly summarize this because we could spend all day talking about this alone. A P3 typically involves a contract between a public authority and a private party in which the private party provides a public service or project that assumes substantial financial, technical, or operational risks. And then the government repays that private sector over the long term if the infrastructure is built and maintained according to specifications. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this, but we're just going to glance over it for today's purposes. So we'll talk a little bit about community assets as an alternative to getting things done. Your citizen groups, your volunteer organizations, and your local businesses are probably the most valuable assets that you have in getting these kind of projects funded and these kind of projects completed. You know, these assets can be leveraged to provide manpower, services, maintenance, and education as it relates to successfully establishing and maintaining an effective stormwater program. Finally, I'm going to talk about cost-sharing opportunities. In short, I would just say, you know, use everything at your disposal. Use your grants, use your loans, fees, utilities, if that's an option. You know, use your community assets. Consider them and use them in a balance that makes sense for your municipality in order to achieve the desired goal. Obviously, different municipalities have different needs, but consider all those opportunities out there. Most importantly, I just say use your local and regional resources. Groups like PSATS, groups like PennVest, National Fish and Wildlife Federation, the Chesapeake Bay Trust, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. You know, these are quite simply advocates for you, for your townships, for your boroughs, for your watershed groups, you know, and they can really assist you in getting you where you need to go. That kind of wraps up the presentation part. What I would like to say is there are some upcoming events.
And Ruth from Chesapeake Bay Foundation, I don't know if you want to pipe in on any of these, but we do have some upcoming events that I think our participants might be interested in. The one I want to plug is next Wednesday's webinar, which is another follow-on to this one about estimating pollutant loads. And also there's going to be a great webinar on April 2nd about successful green infrastructure program drivers. Ruth, I don't know if you want to discuss some of the other ones that we have coming up?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. The other two workshops listed on this event slide are March 25th. There's a Wind Slam workshop. That is an in-person workshop limited to 50 attendees, and it will be held at Penn State Harrisburg in Middletown, Pennsylvania. Anyone interested on details on that can contact me. My contact information is rhocker@cbf.org, and I'll be happy to respond to you as quickly as I can. The April 3rd MS4 workshop that was also listed on the previous slide is also an in-person workshop, and that's intended for those folks in and around the York County area. At this time, if there are any questions for any of the presenters, we'd be happy to entertain those. I have had a few questions come in with regard to information pertaining specifically to today's webcast. And to that end, I do have a few announcements. After the closing of today's webcast, there will be a survey that appears on your screen. We will ask you please to give us some feedback on that. We welcome any comments you may have, and there will be a section available for you to provide those. Today's webinar was recorded. The recording of today's webinar will be posted to CBF's website, and a link to that will be provided along with handouts, a link to several of the other referenced materials, and certificates of completion will be provided in a follow-up email. Electronic copies of the slides will not be made available for separate download. However, viewing today's recorded webinar will be, you will be able to do that at your convenience. Okay, we're starting to get some questions coming in, and we have a few minutes to address them. Andrew or Melissa,
Yes.
We have a question. With respect to illicit discharges, is there any guidance on how to distinguish between groundwater in a storm pipe versus flow that's been tainted with sanitary sewage?
Oh, interesting question. I would think one of the first things you're going to need to do that we always recommend is to trace the source. Because if you follow your pipes upstream and you're not finding any cross-contamination, you're not finding an obvious source, you know, the guy with the concrete truck washing it out right next to your storm drain, then you are going to have to start looking deeper. Very rarely have we seen groundwater getting into these, but it is possible. I think the only way you can be 100% sure would be to do some lab testing. But my recommendation would be the first thing would be to trace it up the pipes to try and find the source, because that's going to be your cheapest and easiest way to figure out how that water is getting in.
Okay, great. We have another question. How do you suggest tree lawn storage / green facilities be restored and or funded after utility expansion or underground repair?
So is the question that the utility repair is conflicting with the green BMP?
I'm sorry, Melissa. I had some trouble hearing you.
No, I said, was the question that the utility work is interfering with the green BMP? I guess I didn't. If you can repeat the question.
It was, how do you suggest tree lawn storage / green facilities be restored / funded after utility expansion or underground repair? So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it would be how would green facilities be restored and funded after there's been some disturbance due to utility expansion or underground repair?
Okay. Site discussion. That would probably be an individual site discussion with the particular utility company that's doing the work, because again, it's going to depend on whether there's an easement on the property or if it's solely on private property or if it's on public property. So I don't think I can answer that specifically without knowing a little more detail, but my guess would be that there would be an agreement of some kind for the construction and the post-construction maintenance before the work is done.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question regarding West Nile virus issues. Some stormwater retention facilities encourage the holding of water. Are there any suggestions on how to balance the issue of water storage with West Nile virus concerns in conjunction with each other?
No, that's a great question, and we get that a lot, especially with municipalities that I've worked with, because especially anytime you're doing anything near a neighborhood, people don't want a mosquito breeding ground. And then a few years ago when we had the West Nile virus outbreak, that was a big problem. So what we have talked about with a lot of these municipalities, these facilities are designed to drain in 48 hours or less, unless it is a standing wet pond, which a lot of people are moving away from. But a lot of the facilities we're getting into now, we don't want them to have standing water after 48 or 72 hours, because it really does take longer than that. It takes about 4 to 7 days, I think, for the mosquitoes to be able to breed. So if we don't have that, then we're not going to be causing the mosquito problem. So that's why we're really looking to promote more of the infiltration practices than the standing wet pond practices.
Okay, great. There are several other questions that will require slightly specific answers and responses. We will be happy to provide copies of those in our follow-up email, but at this time we will be closing the webinar. We appreciate your interest and your attendance, and as I mentioned earlier, links to the handouts, other materials, responses to questions not answered in the public forum, as well as certificates of completion will be provided in a follow-up email. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.